Well, good evening, ladies, and anyone else who decided to walk in tonight. Tonight, I want to talk about fantasy, not just sexual fantasy, but emotional fantasy, romantic fantasy, and psychological escape. Because I think many people underestimate how much of modern life is built around distraction, stimulation, performance, and escape from emotional emptiness. Before we begin, I'd like to explain why I approach Gothic literature differently than many literary commentators out there. My background is in systems analysis. For years, I studied how complex systems behave, how institutions respond to pressure, how narratives influence populations, and how human beings make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. Eventually, I discovered something simple but profound. People are systems too. Human beings are not driven by logic alone. We are influenced by memory, symbolism, identity, desire, fear, aspiration, attachment, loneliness, and countless unconscious processes operating beneath awareness. That realization led me towards psychology, mythology, religion, and eventually Gothic literature. Because Gothic stories are not really about monsters, they are about people. Vampires are often a symbol. The haunted house is often a symbol. The stranger is often a symbol. The hidden room, the forbidden desire, the dark secret, the double, the shadow, and the monster beneath the surface are often symbolic representations of psychological realities people struggle to confront directly. Long before modern psychology developed a formal vocabulary for repression, projection, obsession, trauma, identity, and transformation, Gothic authors were exploring those same subjects through narrative. That is why these stories continue to resonate across generations. The technology changes, the fashions change, the politics change, but the human psyche remains remarkably consistent. Fear, desire, loneliness, temptation, love, loss, the search for meaning. Those experiences remain. What truth about human nature is hiding beneath the surface? Because that is where Gothic literature becomes far more than entertainment. It becomes a mirror. And tonight, we are going to look into that mirror together. Most people are carrying loneliness they barely understand themselves. Some bury it in work, some in attention, some in relationships, some in alcohol, some in social media, some in pornography, some in nightlife, some in endless validation seeking, and some people become addicted to fantasy itself, not because they're weak, but because fantasy temporarily allows people to become someone else. Or perhaps more accurately, fantasy allows people to temporarily escape the exhausting version of themselves they feel trapped in. I think loneliness is one of the least understood forces shaping modern behavior. People often imagine loneliness as physical isolation, but loneliness is much more complicated than that. A person can be surrounded by friends and still feel alone. A person can receive attention and still feel unseen. A person can have a relationship and still feel emotionally disconnected. That kind of loneliness creates hunger, and hungry people search for relief. Fantasy becomes one form of relief. Inside fantasy, possibility returns. The future feels larger. The limitations of ordinary life become less oppressive. For a moment, people can imagine themselves transformed. They can imagine being desired. They can imagine being understood. They can imagine becoming the version of themselves they wish existed. Fantasy, therefore, serves a psychological function. It compensates for emotional needs that feel unmet. It compensates for longing. It compensates for disappointment. It compensates for boredom. It compensates for emotional starvation. It becomes especially obvious when we examine erotic fantasy. People often assume eroticism is primarily physical. I do not think that's true. Some of the strongest erotic energy between two people is psychological long before anything physical happens. Attention, anticipation, mystery, curiosity, emotional tension, feeling desired, feeling seen, feeling wanted, and feeling temporarily free from ordinary life. Those experiences activate the imagination. Once imagination becomes involved, attraction often intensifies dramatically. The mind begins filling in missing information. Possibility becomes narrative. Narrative becomes emotional investment, and emotional investment becomes attachment. That is why people can become emotionally obsessed with someone they barely know. From the outside, this often looks irrational. Inside the experience, it feels completely real because the emotions are real. The longing is real. The excitement is real. The anticipation is real. What may not be real is the story supporting the emotions. The person becomes associated with hope. They become associated with escape, renewal, possibility, validation, and transformation. They stop being merely a person and begin functioning as a symbol. This is where projection enters the picture. Projection occurs when we fill missing information with imagination. The less information we possess, the easier projection becomes. The more mystery exists, the easier projection becomes. The more emotionally hungry a person is, the easier projection becomes. A stranger can become a soulmate. A glance can become a promise. A conversation can become a destiny, not because reality supports those conclusions, but because the imagination does. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We naturally construct narratives, we connect dots, we imagine futures, we create explanations, and sometimes these stories inspire growth, sometimes they create illusions. Fantasy becomes addictive because it offers emotional rewards without requiring emotional risk, at least temporarily. Real intimacy requires vulnerability. Fantasy requires imagination. Real intimacy requires another person. Fantasy requires only ourselves. Fantasy allows perfection. Reality introduces flaws. Fantasy allows certainty. Reality introduces ambiguity. Fantasy allows control. Reality requires compromise. This is one reason anticipation can feel more powerful than fulfillment. Anticipation contains possibility. Possibility feeds imagination. Imagination amplifies desire. Once reality arrives, many possibilities disappear. The mystery becomes knowledge. The projection becomes information. The fantasy collides with an actual human being. And human beings are always more complicated than their fantasies. Many relationships are sustained by anticipation, uncertainty, distance, jealousy, emotional volatility, or fantasy projection. The emotional roller coaster becomes addictive. Every message feels significant. Every absence feels painful. Every interaction feels loaded with meaning. People begin confusing emotional intensity with emotional compatibility. Those are not the same thing. A relationship can feel intense and still be unhealthy. A relationship can feel exciting and still be destructive. A relationship can feel passionate and be fundamentally incompatible. Reality eventually asks questions fantasy cannot answer. Can you trust this person? Can you communicate with them? Can you navigate disappointment together? Can you remain connected when excitement fades? Can you build something meaningful together? Fantasy avoids these questions. Reality demands them. I think this happens to men and women both. although often in different ways. Some men spend years chasing novelty, attention, conquest, fantasy, endless stimulation because stillness forces them to confront emotional emptiness they do not know how to process. Then distraction disappears, loneliness becomes visible, regret becomes visible, and fear becomes visible. Fantasy provides temporary shelter from those experiences. Some women become attached to emotionally unavailable men because longing itself becomes psychologically intoxicating. Distance creates mystery, uncertainty creates obsession, inconsistency creates emotional tension. Emotional tension can feel very similar to passion. Sometimes people mistake emotional chaos for love simply because peace feels unfamiliar. This is not a male problem. This is not a female problem. It is a human problem. The modern culture does not help. Everything constantly pushes stimulation, more attention, more novelty, more excitement, more fantasy, more desire, more validation, more performance. Very little encourages emotional stillness. Very little encourages depth. Very little encourages introspection. As a result, many people become emotionally restless, even inside relationships. They stop knowing how to simply be present with one another. Everything must feel exciting, everything must feel emotionally charged, and everything must feel dramatic. Yet meaningful relationship often grows in quieter ways. Trust grows quietly, consistency grows quietly, safety grows quietly, friendship grows quietly, and respect grows quietly. The culture celebrates excitement while overlooking stability, yet stability is often what allows intimacy to flourish. Maybe this is part of why so many people feel lonely while surrounded by endless access to attention, entertainment, sex, fantasy, and distraction. Because attention is not intimacy, desire is not trust, fantasy is not emotional safety, and stimulation is not love. A person can receive enormous attention and still feel unseen. A person can be desired and feel emotionally isolated. A person can be surrounded by admirers and still feel lonely. What many people truly want is understanding, acceptance, belonging, and connection. The feeling that another person genuinely sees them beneath the performance. Now, none of this means fantasy itself is bad. Fantasy is part of human psychology. Eroticism matters. Imagination matters. Desire matters. Playfulness matters. Seduction matters. Mystery matters. Fantasy is also one of the engines of creativity. Every story begins as fantasy. Every invention begins as fantasy. Every work of art begins as fantasy. The ability to imagine something that does not yet exist is one of humanity's greatest strengths. Healthy fantasy enriches life. Unhealthy fantasy replaces life. Healthy fantasy inspires action. Unhealthy fantasy becomes avoidance. Healthy fantasy deepens the experience. Unhealthy fantasy disconnects people from the experience. As we move deeper into Gothic literature throughout this channel, you will notice these themes appearing again and again. The monster often represents desires we fear. The haunted house often represents memory. The stranger often represents unknown parts of ourselves. The hidden room often represents truths we do not want to face. The stories endure because the psychology endures. Human beings continue wrestling with the same emotional conflicts generation after generation. We want freedom and safety, desire and stability, mystery and understanding, fantasy and reality. Perhaps growing emotionally means learning not to destroy fantasy, but to place it in its proper role. Fantasy can inspire us, motivate us, awaken us, encourage us, but it cannot live our lives for us. Eventually, we must step out of the imagination and into reality. Eventually, we must stop projecting and start knowing. Eventually, we must stop performing and start connecting, because real intimacy begins where fantasy ends. Not because fantasy is bad, but because genuine connection requires something imagination alone cannot provide: another human being. Anyway, that's enough wandering through the human psyche for one evening. I'll see you next time.